Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for making it out here and braving the weather and all the ice. Today, we will be hearing an address from Dr. Ryan Haecker, Accused, the legacy of the Dreyfus Affair. The Austin Union is pleased to be sponsoring this talk with the Nationalist Institute, which is a nonprofit research institute here in Austin, dedicated to the study of the intersection between philosophy and theology. As the University of Austin student-run debate society, the Union aims to pursue truth through debate and reasoned discourse, not only within the university's walls, but also throughout the local community and the wider world, as we're doing here this evening. Tonight's talk examines the Dreyfus Affair, exploring how false accusations and miscarriages of justice produce constitutional crises. For some context for those of us here who are perhaps not as familiar with the historical episode, as well as its applicability to today, here's an informative and concise excerpt from Dr. Haecker's own abstract. Quote, when the French artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of having sold French artillery plans to the German army, he was initially arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. The army discovered the true culprit, but chose to uphold Dreyfus's conviction out of fear that his exoneration would discredit the army and ultimately weaken the nation of France herself. With the leap beyond the era of printed newspapers to viral social media, accusations of alleged guilt can now be digitally replicated at light speed, relayed across the world by orbiting communication satellites, and through the liquid purchase of its algorithmic trading, concretely assembled into more vitriolic condemnations of eternal punishment. End quote. As for its background, in addition to serving as the president of the aforementioned Nationalist Institute, Dr. Haecker is also a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, an institute which is specialized in the study of the fine arts, art history, and the humanities for more than a century. He previously served as a university librarian and assistant professor of theology at the University of Austin. Dr. Haecker holds a PhD in theology and religious studies from the University of Cambridge's Peterhouse College and a master's degree in theology and religious studies from the University of Nottingham. He also holds a master's degree in information studies from the University of Texas at Austin, from where he also earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and history. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Restoring Reason, Theology of Logic and Origin of Alexandria. Provides a theological interpretation of Origen's system of logic, and is also the co-editor of the forthcoming New Trinitarian Ontologies, a compilation of essays discussing the relationship between metaphysics and the Trinity. Additionally, he's the author of 60 academic articles. Now for some logistical information. Following his address, we will implement the Chatham House rule, meaning the audience members are prohibited from attributing any spoken information to specific speakers. Then, former University of Austin Dean Morgan Murrieta will cross-examine Dr. Haecker, followed by current Assistant Professor of Political Theory Jonathan Ullman. After this period of cross-examination, the floor will open to audience members. This particular lecture, which we're all about to hear, is the product of months of labor, and Dr. Haecker is perhaps the most extravagant and boisterous rhetorician I've had the privilege of witnessing. So I have no doubt that we will all find his address both intellectually compelling and entertaining, and altogether very stimulating. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Haecker.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, thank you all so much for coming to this event. It's been long in the making, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we'll have later today. As a few preliminary remarks, I'd like to say that this event is co-hosted along with the Austin Union by the Nationalist Institute for the Advanced Study of Theology and Philosophy. Many of you have come to our reading groups, and I hope to encourage many more to do so. We are hosting weekly reading groups this term and onwards, and we're also planning to develop a seminar series in the future. So this is the term card for the reading group of this winter. I hope you can see it here. Yes, okay. So we just finished reading Ferdinand Ulrich's Homo Abyssus on Sunday. This is a lecture for the term card, but later we will be reading Arthur Schopenhauer, Julie Kristeva, Joseph de Maistre, George Sorel, Gaston Baston, Oswald Spengler, and Emil Cioran. The Nationalist Institute aims to liberally engage with across the boundaries of theology and philosophy, building a highway in the sky for the best and greatest research in theology and philosophy to come to Austin, Texas, and for you all to benefit from it, as well as to allow for you to exchange ideas and develop your thoughts freely and liberally across the boundaries of theology and philosophy, and hopefully to create a better future. So I hope that you'll take an interest in this. If you would like to sign up for the reading group, there are sign-up sheets in the back. You're welcome to give us your name and email address, and we'll be in contact with you later As a few preliminary remarks, we're planning to host a series of seminars later this year. We have 3 seminars in mind. One is a Jesuit cybernetics research unit that we hope to host on the topic of Jesuit cybernetics, which I've been writing about recently. And if you come to some of those seminars, you may know what that's about. If you haven't, come talk to me later. We have lots to talk about. The next, however, is a talk on Michel Foucault and gender and sexuality in the Church Fathers. So it's going to be hosted by Reverend Dr. Matt Salter, who some of you have already met, and we're hoping to host that at the Seminary of the Southwest later this summer. But we have a very exciting seminar coming up later this autumn, which is an event on the philosophy and thought of Leo Strauss. And the seminar is titled Contra Strauss, the Theological Political Problem. It will be co-hosted, we hope, with, as we've been discussing, with the Admiral Adams Institute in Harvard. So if you'd like to participate in it remotely online or even in person, follow our details online. We hope to attract people from the Northeast, the Boston corridor, but it will be a hybrid event, so all of you can also participate. And we'll be inviting papers and hoping to solicit it and build up a great conversation about the theological resonances and challenges of Leo Strauss's thought for today. All right, so with that, I will begin. Yes. Accusations, when left unexamined, easily come to be regarded as facts, and sometimes even those upon which the destinies of nations turn. When an accusation is made, the accused is naturally held to be guilty by the public, not only of the alleged crime, but of having disturbed the peace, and if exonerated, of having retroactively harmed the reputation of the accuser. In Sophocles' Antigone, the sister of the slain Polynices, tells the tyrant Cleon, "Let the dead and the God of dead bear witness. I have no love for a friend who loves in words alone. I give myself to death long ago, so I may serve the dead." When, like Antigone, standing before Creon, the accuser is the sovereign of a nation, she is compelled to challenge the sovereign ruler to publicly acknowledge their fault, their fallibility, and thereby to admit the loss of authority that sustains their power. She who is in this way accused by the sovereign thus stands paradoxically both inside and outside the political community, for to stand accused is to be held in contempt for trial by the polity, yet to challenge the authority of the sovereign is also to stand opposed to its corporate interest, to appear less as a defendant and more likely to be seen as a traitor and a terrorist. When, moreover, the sovereign knows such accusations to be false, the accused's demand for truth is regarded as the most dangerous and terrible of weapons, one that threatens to delegitimize the very principles of justice that uphold political rule and the social order. In perhaps no other case is this conflict so evident as in the Dreyfus Affair, in which a French artillery officer, Alfred Dreyfus, came to be accused of treason by betraying the French army by giving plans for a new artillery piece to the German army. At the acme of the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era, he was accused in 1894 of having sold French artillery plans to the German army. He was initially arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. When, however, the French army discovered the true culprit, it chose to uphold Dreyfus's conviction and exculpate the traitor out of fear that the exoneration of Dreyfus would come to discredit the French army. Ordinarily, such a wanton disregard of justice would have dealt a death sentence to Dreyfus. Yet he would have another chance at justice. At the height of his fame and fortune, the novelist Émile Zola published an open letter, J'accuse, to the president of France. He wrote, quote, "My duty is to speak out, not to become an accomplice to this travesty. My nights would otherwise be haunted by the specter of an innocent man, far away, suffering the most horrible of tortures for a crime he did not commit." When the army's cover-up was later exposed, the original question of the truth of Dreyfus's guilt was superseded by the far more perilous and calamitous political conflict over whether or not to imperil the legitimacy of the nation by acknowledging the army's complicity in knowingly prosecuting and then covering up the innocence of an honorable man. For nearly 5 years, France was divided between Dreyfusards, such as Charles Péguy, who believed Dreyfus to be innocent, and anti-Dreyfusards, such as Charles Maurras, who believed that, regardless of his innocence, Dreyfus should, once convicted, remain condemned so as to preserve the honor of the army and the integrity of the nation before its coming conflict with Germany. Péguy famously remarked, "Everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics." The mysterious question of truth and justice was, in this tragic episode, thus superseded by the mundane administration of power, as the career and livelihood of one man was sacrificed for political expediency to protect the supposed corporate interests of the nation as a whole. As the high priest Caiaphas said of Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospel of John, it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people and the whole nation should perish not. When, after nearly a decade of dispute, Dreyfus was at last exonerated, this affair had contributed to the toppling of one French government, propelling the incipient movement of European Zionism, which later led to the creation of the State of Israel, and initiating the episodic reactions of later French fascism, which would ultimately culminate in the Nazi-collaborationist regime of Vichy France. In a surprising way, the cause of the anti-Dreyfusards is today best represented by a collusion between techno-oligarchs of digital capitalism and those who would justify their right to rule. Like Marat, they defend the noble lie of Plato's Republic and uphold the priority of political order of truth over justice. And yet, with the challenge that has recently been made to this alliance, we may yet find a new way to recognize how the scapegoat provides a sacrificial alternative that undermines their right to rule and points to a higher destiny eschatologically to be decided, and yet evident to us here and now amongst us. The lesson of the Dreyfus Affair has never been more urgently needed. On the eve of the 1900 Paris World's Fair, at the acme of French cultural achievement, it exposed every nation to see a deep spiritual crisis of injustice in service to politics. As Zola and Piguet so forcefully argued, the wrongful conviction of any one man, however insignificant, is a poisonous injustice that afflicts the heart of the community as a whole. The Dreyfus Affair can thus be recognized as a spiritual war to restore the mystique of Republican France, which, in an imminent overflow of the Holy Spirit, calls for a popular revolt against modern bureaucratic states that would perpetrate injustice against any one person to ensure the interests of the many or of the few. In a Dreyfusard style, René Girard had critiqued Leo Strauss for his failure to observe how the mimetic rivalry of elites requires a scapegoat, how such a victim must be innocent to be sacrificed, and yet how the cause of the martyr for justice should also serve to successively invalidate the legitimacy of the governing regime. In return from the political to the mystical, the scapegoat of today calls for a new crusade of Republican virtue to save the spirit of the law, our living constitution, and our natural rights from those who, in rewriting its letter, would twist the law against the cause of justice and continue to sacrifice the innocent upon the altar of their vanity. The idea of a constitution arises from the belief that sovereign power should be regulated by a basic written law. In The Statesman, Plato had defended the best rule of a wise king, and yet deferred it to the second best rule of law, of written laws that can regulate the affairs even when we fail to be wise. And in the Politics, Aristotle had further distinguished a constitution that is established for the arrangement of the offices of the states from ordinary law, which could be promulgated by rulers and arbitrated by judges. In the Gospels, the political rule is initially assumed in the nativity scene by the newborn king who bow as the Oriental Magi, before in the Passion narrative it is renounced as not of this world and suspended in Christ's ascensions into heaven. With the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity, political rule had expressly in Eusebius begun to be re-envisioned in the image of Christ, who, in contrast to all pagan deities, empties himself of unilateral control to be born as a child and die on the cross as a final sacrifice to cancel the mimetic rivalry that perpetuates tragic violence. Like Socrates, the trial of Jesus had reframed the rights of the accused as a service to the least among us. As early as the 6th century Code of Justinian, the presumption of innocence before proven guilty was incorporated into Roman law. Since Magna Carta, this presumption had been enshrined in English common law as the right of due process, which holds that governments must prove the guilt of a defendant before punishment. Crucially, a defendant cannot be punished by a sovereign held to have committed a crime or in any way defamed as guilty before a fair and impartial trial of their peers. All of this is written into, I believe, the Fifth Amendment to the American Constitution. This regulation of sovereign power by law can only be upheld by an independent judiciary. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu argued that unrestricted sovereign power could only be held in check by a constitutional separation of powers, in which legislatures make the laws, judges interpret the laws, and sovereigns enforce the laws. For the sovereign to deny a citizen due process would be to violate this very constitutional framework of the separation of powers, to overthrow the Constitution, and by this fact to collapse liberty of law into unchecked despotism, whether in a nation or in any other civic body. Following Thomas Jefferson's design, the United States Constitution was envisioned as a developing compact between the government and the people, in which the addition of new amendments must be ratified by representatives of the people. In contrast to the French experiment that quickly reverted into Jacobin dictatorship, it could not be abolished, suspended, or rewritten without popular consent and approval. All these restraints were ultimately rooted in the shared conviction stated in the Declaration of Independence that sovereignty derives from the consent of the governed, and all humans are endowed with inalienable rights, and to due process and the protection of life and liberty. It is this constitutional order that a disregard for due process most radically undermines. In September 1894, a French military intelligence received a crucial document from a maid spying on the German embassy in Paris. Known as Le Bordereau, the memo, this unsigned, undated note offered to deliver secret information about France's new 120mm artillery piece to the German military attaché. Faced with a case of treason, the war minister, General Auguste Meursault, launched a frantic secretive investigation. With scant evidence, the inquiry quickly fixated on culprit Alfred Dreyfus, an artillery officer. They looked at the list of all of the members of the general staff, and they found one artillery officer who was a Jew. And they said, well, he's from Alsace, he's a Jew, it must be him. On the surface, Dreyfus appeared an improbable spy. He was wealthy, happily married, deeply problematic, and had no discernible motive to betray France. Yet he was Jewish, born in Alsace, and a product of a Republican meritocracy in an army still dominated by aristocratic Catholic and monarchist elites. On October 13th, 1894, Dreyfus was summoned, arrested, accused of treason, interrogated, and even offered a revolver to commit suicide. Dreyfus Drummond announced the arrest under the headline, "The Treason of the Jew Dreyfus." Other newspapers followed suit, unleashing a campaign of sensationalism and anti-Semitic rhetoric. This, by the way, was the nation of France, which was the first nation to emancipate Jews to be equal citizens of France. Public opinion rapidly turned against the accused, creating a climate in which justice became increasingly difficult. The army's case against Dreyfus rested almost entirely on handwriting analysis. Alphonse Bertillon, the inventor of forensic anthropometry, advanced an implausible theory that Dreyfus had practiced auto-forgery, whereby Dreyfus had deliberately imitated his own handwriting. They saw the handwriting, it didn't match Dreyfus, so they invented a theory that he must have imitated his handwriting so as to confuse the authorities. Dreyfus was court-martialed, opened behind closed door on December 19th, 1894. The prosecution struggled to establish a clear motive, and several of Dreyfus's superiors testified to his competence, patriotism. Nevertheless, General Mercier illegally supplied the judges with a secret dossier containing forged or misinterpreted documents that neither Dreyfus nor his lawyer were allowed to see. On December 22nd, the military court unanimously convicted him of high treason and sentenced him to life in prison on the French penal colony island of French Guiana. And this, by the way, was the most terrible island. It was closed before Dreyfus's trial because it was considered too terrible for anyone to live in. It was infested with malaria, and everyone, almost 75% of people who moved there died. So it was expected that if he remained there, he would have died. And had he remained, it was very likely that he would. Before his imprisonment, however, Dreyfus underwent a public ceremony of degradation. He was paraded in front of 10,000 spectators. He had his insignia stripped in front of him. His epaulets were torn off. His sword was broken. All the while, the crowd shouted, "Death to the Jews, death to the Jews." And during this ceremony, Dreyfus said, "Soldats, enterrés, un innocent, vive la France, vive la armée." Soldiers, an innocent man is being disgraced. Long live France, long live the army. He was then deported to the brutal prison colony of Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana, where he endured years of isolation, chained to his bed in the sweltering heat. The turning point in the affair, however, came in 1896, when Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picard became head of military intelligence. While reviewing intercepted communications, Picard discovered a telegram addressed to Major Ferdinand Volson Esterhazy. Picard soon realized that Esterhazy's handwritings matched that of the Bordeaux. Remember that the handwriting on the memo did not look like Dreyfus's. So when they found this letter, it matched exactly the handwriting. And they published the memo in the French papers, and his banker said that it matched his handwriting. Also, his mistress said that it matched his handwriting. So many people came out to testify that this was in fact the handwriting of Esterhazy, not of Dreyfus. However, when Picard reported these findings, the army refused to reopen the case. Fearful of a scandal that would damage the institutional authority of the army, they transferred Picard to Tunisia and later imprisoned him. Rather than listening to the person who threatened to overthrow their case, they imprisoned him. Meanwhile, Major Hubert Joseph Henry forged additional documents, the infamous Files Henry, to reinforce the case against Dreyfus. After Esterhazy was acquitted by the army, Esterhazy was put on trial, but he was acquitted by the army in another sham trial so that they could uphold the guilt of Dreyfus. The famous novelist Émile Zola published his explosive open letter, J'accuse, in Aurora, directly accusing the army and the government of conspiracy. This piece sold 300,000 copies in a day, electrified France, and elevated the Dreyfus Affair into the defining political struggle of a generation. Now, typically, this newspaper circulated like a few 10,000 copies a day, 300,000 copies in one day. Everyone in Paris was reading it. And moreover, it was the first time that a writer, novelist, had publicly accused the nation and the army of complicity in covering up a trial. It was the first case of the press speaking truth to power and holding political authority accountable to their grave miscarriage of justice. For his courage, Émile Zola was prosecuted for libel, forced into exile, and in his later days, he was murdered by his chimney sweeper, who blocked up his chimney to asphyxiate him at night. This was later confessed on his deathbed. In 1898, War Minister Godfrey Cavaignac signed a final proof of Dreyfus's guilt. Yet on the evening of August 13th, an anti-Dreyfus officer in Cavaignac's cabinet noticed that the paper, the Files Henry, remember the forgery that it made, had been glued together in a clumsy forgery. They found that it consisted of 3 different kinds of paper that had been glued together when they exposed it to candlelight. So it couldn't have just been one document. It had to have been put together. They took Dreyfus's original handwriting and they appended the additional elements that would have been seen to incriminate him. Cavaignac confronted Colonel Henry. After about an hour of questioning, Henry broke down and confessed to forging the document to booster the case against Dreyfus. Henry was arrested and later committed suicide the next day by slitting his own throat with a razor. This revelation forced the Supreme Court of France to order a retrial. In 1899, a court-martial unfolded under siege-like tension. There were anti-Jewish riots in the streets. There were pistol duels between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. And Dreyfus's own lawyer, Ferdinand Lombardi, was even shot on the eve of the trial by an extremist. Yet again, Dreyfus was convicted by the court by a one-judge majority and convicted to serve 10 years in prison. But by this time, France had had enough. And the president of France, wishing to call an end to the international scandal, even Tsarist Russia was ridiculing France for anti-Semitism and for their miscarriage of justice in this case. So to bring it into the scandal, they publicly pardoned Dreyfus. But this was a very perilous question because Dreyfus had always maintained that he was innocent. If he accepted a pardon, he would have to admit that he was guilty, only to be released from prison. So the anti-Dreyfusards saw this as an emblem of his guilt. The Dreyfusards saw it as betrayal, because if they defended Dreyfus as innocent, if he accepted the pardon, then he accepted that he was guilty, and he betrayed his own cause. However, Dreyfus, having endured 5 years imprisonment in Devil's Island, his hair was gray, his teeth were falling out, he hadn't spoken to anyone in years, his wife was begging him to come home to see their young children, he accepted the pardon. Exhausted and from so many years of torment, Dreyfus reluctantly accepted the presidential pardon on September 1899. After nearly 5 years in prison on Devil's Island, his health had visibly deteriorated. He feared that a subsequent prison sentence could lead to his death. He thus reluctantly accepted the pardon to spare his life and to allow him to return to France again as a free citizen. Yet in tacitly accepting his guilt, he would thereafter be judged by the anti-Dreyfusards to have been guilty of the accusations and by the Dreyfusards to have betrayed his own cause. Now, the Dreyfus Affair was pivotal in the development of 3 ways of history: in the history of Christianity, in the history of Judaism, and the history of France. In France, it showed that Republican France could not, in this case, uphold justice for every one of its citizens. For Judaism, it showed that the emancipation of the Jews was never complete, or it couldn't be complete at this time, and it would later propel many reactions against it. And for Christians, it showed that Christians would betray their fellow countrymen if it seemed like they could be seen as traitors to their nation, or if they somehow compromised the integrity and the honor of the army. It amplified and created anti-Semitic riots across Europe. It revealed that even in emancipated France, prejudice persisted in both the press and public riots. It also birthed an enduring organization of human rights, Accusations, the Ligue de la Droite la Homme, and a nationalist group like Accusations Français, which blended monarchism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism. These divisions contributed to chronic instability and economic crisis, which weakened trust in institutions and hampered French rearmament against the looming threat of German aggression. The Dreyfus Affair's most tragic consequences were evident in Vichy France. After 1940, the German defeat in France, Vichy France enacted anti-Semitic laws, deported over 70,000 Jews to the death camps. In fact, Dreyfus's granddaughter, who he loved very much, was a resistant discredit the merit of Jewish Zionism. Observing Dreyfus falsely accused of treason convinced Theodor Herzl, who was the journalist who saw the degradation ceremony in person, that anti-Semitism was an inescapable social condition in Europe. He thought that if 100 years on from Jewish emancipation, the Jews were still being ridiculed and attacked in France, where could they find a home? It's a bit like, think of like Black Lives Matter, for instance, today, where they say 70 years on from Martin Luther King and civil rights, why is it that young Black men are still being killed? So then they asked, well, what we can do? And Theodor Herzl's response was, if the Jews are still going to be attacked in riots in the streets and falsely imprisoned, then maybe they need a new home. They need to find a new homeland, and they need their own nation. Yes, so the prosecution of Dreyfus spurred him to publish Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in 1896, and organized the first Zionist Congress in 1897, which later culminated in 1945 or so, 1948, I think, in the founding of the State of Israel. These long-term consequences of the Dreyfus Affair continue to shape the world today. For all of its feverish convulsions, the Dreyfus Affair ended without apparent results. It had first condemned and only thereafter pardoned Dreyfus, yet without conclusively demonstrating either his guilt or establishing his innocence. The subsequent French Supreme Court exoneration could then as now be judged by the anti-Dreyfusards to have been compromised by political interest, as was his initial conviction. The higher mystical question of whether or not he was truly guilty was in this way superseded by the more mundane political question of whether or not it was in the interest of this or that party to tell the story of his trial horror against Dreyfus. The hidden truth of his culpability, a truth that perhaps only he and God could know, had thus been exposed to the judgment of the world in a forensic scrutiny that would define his legacy for all time. It is, however, in the higher light of eternity that the Dreyfus Affair casts a shadow of enduring theological significance, principally in the writings of Charles Péguy and Charles Maurras. On the one hand, Péguy judged that even if Dreyfus was guilty, he should, as a martyr for the Republic and the Republican mystique, still be defended, because the defense of Dreyfus elicited the courage to defend the Republic. On the other hand, Charles Maurras judged that even if Dreyfus was innocent, he should, having once been convicted by the army, still be condemned to uphold the honor of the army and the integrity of France. In condemning Dreyfus in spite of his possible innocence, Maurras held the interest of politics to supersede the hidden or mystical truth of his alleged guilt. Yet in championing Dreyfus in spite of his equally possible guilt, Péguy recalls the higher theological calling of jurisprudence, in which, from Aeschylus's Orestes to Victor Hugo's Misérables, the judgment of the courts is a blind mirror of divine judgment in expectation of its eschatological fulfillment. I've written quite a lot here about Charles Péguy, but for interest of time, I'm going to skip it. But what I will say is that Péguy is fascinating here because he was a very eccentric combination of French nationalism, of socialism, and of pious Catholicism. And he believed that the Dreyfus Affair was not just a political question, but was a religious call. He said that it was a specifically religious question. And he called it mystical Dreyfusardism, which he did not believe could be reducible to the party or cause of Dreyfus. And he believed that the apparent betrayal of Dreyfusardism by Dreyfus, by accepting the pardon, did not invalidate mystical Dreyfusism. The reason why is because mystical Dreyfusardism was a calling to the Republican mystique, which he thought was also the Christian mystique. And what he meant by that is he thought that in order for us to be faithful to the event of the founding of the French Republic, just as we are to be faithful to the women we love or the men we love or to our family or to our nation or to our God, we have to be willing to give up everything for it. And what he saw in Dreyfusardism was that characters like Émile Zola and himself were willing to give up everything, even to risk their own death, for a stranger who they did not know, because it served the cause of justice. And the justice was a higher interest than any political party or even the apparent expediency of the army and the nation of France. And he thought without that, we would corrupt the entire nation. We would sacrifice one person to uphold the nation and yet destroy the nation in doing so. So mystical Dreyfusardism, mystical republicanism was also mystical Catholic piety for him. That is, it was a way of honoring God through honoring justice to the nation and to the least deserving or the stranger within that nation who, though we do not know, we still owe that same service to justice to. Okay, so I haven't written out everything else that I wanted to say, but I will extemporaneously summarize the rest. So Charles Maurras, who was the opponent of Charles Péguy in this case, he founded a political party that still exists in France today called Action Française. And Action Française argued that although we do not need to believe that Catholicism is true, we should for expediency's sake, teach people that it is, because it is better that we have a religion that serves the social order by upholding hierarchy and authority and teaching people obedience to law and to the national interest than not. So religion is a social instrument for social cohesion that serves the interests of France, the army, and the nation. This was later argued against vehemently by Charles Péguy, by Jacques Maritain, and ultimately condemned by the Vatican. And nonetheless, it was a curious instrumentalization of religion, or you might say a mystification of politics for religion, for the expediency of politics in the nation, even for a kind of hyper-French nationalism in response to German aggression that was an incipient movement that can be regarded as proto-fascistic, along with those movements in Spain and Italy and Germany. And although France didn't go the same route as those other countries, Charles Maurras nearly had the chance on at least one occasion to commit a coup d'etat against the French Republic and to take power. He didn't, unfortunately so, but the movement that he inspired would later take root in Vichy France after the fall of the Third French Republic, after the fall of France in 1940. So the conflict is live there, and it perhaps still continues today. The key, however, is the question of justice. Is justice something that we can amend based on the expediency of the nation? Should we suspend our cause for justice because it is not useful for us to uphold the integrity and honor of the nation as a whole, or even the public reputation that we might want to celebrate abroad? Or should we be willing to recognize our own culpability when we fail to uphold those principles of justice, when we wrongfully accuse someone and deny them due process in order to defend their honor and their innocence? And if so, we must be willing, as Péguy recognized, not only to allow for the reputation, the integrity of the nation, the army, any political community to be sullied, but also to sacrifice our own welfare for its interest. So the connection here that I drew previously to the techno-oligarchs and Theo Strauss is that I believe today we are witnessing a collusion between populism and techno-oligarchy. And what I mean is that the old establishment that prevailed since the end of the Cold War, that had centered itself on a kind of bureaucratic management of opposed political parties that would exchange power, but implement the same economic policies that would advance the interests of financial capital from across the world, I believe has collapsed because of the loss of the interest that served to the working classes and to a wide swath of people across the nation who, though they did not have the economic clout to challenge the political elites, nonetheless have the right to vote and can vote into office demagogues who will champion their interests, demagogues who are often tacitly allied with the same powers of technology, monopoly capitalism that have previously held them in bondage. So what I believe is happening today is that, and we can see this in the ascendancy of Donald Trump, we can say it nakedly, is that we have a demagogic former elite, a kind of Caesarist figure, who has allied himself with the oligarchs of technology, previously having sided with the Democratic Party, now with the Republican Party, and yet under the auspices of serving the democratic will, but in a way that is less likely to do so, because ultimately the interests of the elite, of those who control the instruments of financial capitalism and the technological panoply that supports it, will lead to a greater monopoly centralization on their own powers and industries and the ability to gather wealth unto themselves for their own private purposes. So under this auspices, the question emerges, how can we sustain little democracy? How can we sustain something like the popular will that will serve the interests of the greatest good of the most people? And the danger that we're facing, I think, is that there's a liability that in this rivalry between techno-oligarchs, which René Girard identified as mimetic rivalry, that is a competition for prestige and for the emblems of power and virtue, that the only way to escape from the rivalry that cannot culminate in any satisfying victory, you can never have anyone who colonizes the moon or colonizes Mars or builds the tallest tower, the tallest spaceship. Every time there's going to be competition, that will be unsatisfied. The only way to overcome that is to have some escape mechanism that allows for the rivalry to be momentarily canceled. And the way that can be done is when the system fails, you can blame the scapegoat. You can blame someone who, although they may be innocent, nonetheless has to be the victim of the political authority that has otherwise failed to achieve its goals. This is what René Girard called the scapegoat mechanism of mimetic rivalry. And the challenge I see here is that if we regard the scapegoat as simply an incidental, negligible, disposable person that doesn't deserve rights to due process and justice, then we will continue to uphold the interest of politics first at the expense of justice. We'll refuse to serve the higher ends of justice that should serve the common interest to upholding the rights and privileges even of the weakest and the marginalized for the power of the strong and for the majority collective. Rather, I think what we need to see, as Girard later recognized, is that the scapegoat can be seen as a sacrificial victim, but one who is honored in their sacrifice. And what I want to call attention to lastly is what Péguy saw in the nobility of Dreyfus. Dreyfus was not an exceptional man. He was understated, he was humble, he was polite and punctual, but there was nothing exceptional about him. He was an ordinary man placed in extraordinary circumstances. But in those extraordinary circumstances, he was called to uncommon valor and virtue. He was called to do something that was heroic by upholding his own cause for justice for the good of the nation. And Peggy recognized that this served a higher end. It served the end of the nation of France as a whole. He said that it served the interest of the eternal salvation of France, that all of France and its justice should be upheld by the honor of one man. So with that, I'd like to briefly say that many of you will have come here hoping to hear about justice in France and elsewhere. And there are many of you who may know that there has been great injustice done in the world, and even in our community. I would like to acknowledge one person here who has suffered terribly and has upheld he has upheld the honor of his community with the utmost integrity. And so if you will join me, please give your hands of applause to Christoph Jacobs. And with that, we'll hand over to Morgan Marietta to offer his response.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me there. I would love to be in Austin with you tonight. To everyone I know from last year, it's great to see you. For those who have arrived this year, you may have heard my name mentioned. Just to set a rumor to rest, it is not true that Pano Canellas sent me to Devil's Island. As the song goes, I'm alive and well in Tennessee, though all of my ex-employers are in Texas. As far as I remember, I was the first to leave by choice rather than by exile. I might come back one day, but only if I get a bust larger than Pano's. And since there's not a lot of stone left available, I don't think that's going to happen. So probably not. So there are several people there that I am proud to have been associated with. Just to name a few: Ryan, Christoph, Armand, Milo. McKenna Conlon is a person of substance. And there are several other people, of course, that I should mention. But this is on video, so I will not tarnish their reputations with my praise, but they have earned it. So I'll just say a few words about what Ryan presented, especially in relation to what I care about, which is university constitutionalism. One of the reasons I came to UATX was to establish university constitutionalism, and one of the reasons I left is that it had failed. I think Ryan is correct that the Dreyfus Affair tells us a great deal about this, and I admire that he did an outstanding job of explaining the Dreyfus Affair for a half hour without mentioning UATX at all. I take it that that was my job. So let me just say first that of what I am proud of about how UATX acted in these situations. I'm proud that when UATX decided to falsely accuse some people, we picked Gentiles. Unlike the usual pattern, the Jews were left alone. I see this as generational improvement over the Dreyfus Affair. I'm proud that we merely went after a Catholic rather than a Jew. It does my heart good. So now let me talk about what I am not proud of. A wise man told me once to never say more than 3 things at a time. So I'm going to say 3 things as quickly as I can. Why constitutionalism failed at UATX, why constitutionalism is needed, especially at UATX, and how you might restore it. All of these relate to a social science concept of the dog that didn't bark. Scholars most of the time explain things that they see, but some of the most important things are often the ones that are missing. They're harder to recognize. In the Dreyfus case, one of the questions is why more people didn't stand up for him. I'm going to say something about that. And it applies to constitutionalism, because you see, without constitutionalism, there are a lot of dogs that won't bark, good dogs. And it's harder to see that because you have to understand that they would have said things if constitutionalism had been there. So now, first of all, it occurs to me that some of you there might not be entirely familiar with what happened at UATX. So let me give you a quick rendition. A student was accused of wrongdoing and expelled. That was on the first day of class. A professor was accused of wrongdoing and fired. That was at the end of the first term. I was heavily involved in both of those cases. And I can tell you without hesitation that I don't believe either one of them did it. They did not do what they were accused of doing. Each of them was denied due process. Both of those cases went to the adjudicative panel. The adjudicative panel ruled in their favor in both cases and ordered reinstatement. And the university ignored the court's ruling and did not follow them. Even I didn't see that coming. I actually thought that the university would follow the court's rulings, but they did not. The board then changed the Constitution to remove these sorts of protections. And now, under the existing Constitution, if someone is accused, there's no hearing, there's no jury, there are no rights to speak of. The faculty are essentially at-will employees, and the students are subject to concentrated power, the opposite of constitutionalism. If any of this surprises you, or you didn't actually know some of this, one of the crucial facets of constitutionalism is its public nature. If the controversies and the rulings of the court are hidden, if they're secret, it's impossible for power to be constrained, and it's impossible for a constitutional order to work. One of the saddest things to me was when the board started to amend the Constitution without telling anyone. The Constitution wasn't given the respect, at least, to amend it rather than just erase and add. There's no such thing as secret or hidden constitutionalism. So why did it fail? Why did constitutionalism fail at UATX? Because constitutionalism is hard. We assume because it succeeded with the United States Constitution that it's simple, but even that was a very long road, and there were many violations early on. Constitutionalism failed at UATX because it requires admitting that you are wrong. It requires admitting errors. And there are two types of people who don't like to admit that they're wrong. One is academics. We are an arrogant people. And the other one is billionaires, because they don't have to. And at UATX, we combined the two. And that made constitutionalism especially hard. So why was Dreyfus on the island for so long? Because releasing him would have required people in power to admit that they were wrong, and people in power don't do that. Now, I understand it. UATX has always had, from the beginning, a defensive posture. It has many enemies. And some leaders really wanted to be constitutional, but they thought that our enemies would exploit it, and they thought it would do too much damage. So they said, let's hide the errors for now. We can be constitutional later. To coin a phrase, Lord, give me constitutionalism, but not yet. And that prayer applies to a lot of things. But power is like sin. It doesn't stop making demands. If you don't do the right thing now, the time will not announce itself later. And the board then abandoned constitutionalism as a whole. And I think that was the great mistake. The reason constitutionalism failed was ego. So why is it needed? Let me say a quick word about Albert Einstein. There's a famous quote of his. He was a famous constitutionalist. And he said, the right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true. That was the great idea of UATX, that people would not hide things at all. They would speak openly. Most universities suffer from constant concealing of the truth. They don't talk about controversial things. They will not depart from expected opinions. Faculty will not present evidence which is not welcome. They conceal a great part of what they believe to be true. And UHX was meant to be different, but it will not be without constitutional protections. For those of you who have not been faculty, the Constitution was meant to replace the tenure system. It was meant to provide a better protection of academic liberty. But if faculty don't have tenure, or they don't have a constitution, they simply won't speak their mind because they're afraid of offending Barry. They're afraid of offending Neil. They're afraid of offending Joe. They're afraid of offending the board. A lot of dogs will not bark if the Constitution is not there. And you may not notice it right away because the faculty will say things, but then you won't know what they are not saying. And the same is true of the students. The students will eventually not bark. They'll bark a little bit more because students have always had more courage than faculty. But the other dog you won't hear is the faculty who won't go there. Without tenure and without constitutionalism, some faculty will leave, but many will not come at all. Because a university without real protection of academic liberty is merely a think tank with students. It's not a university. So let me end by saying how it might be restored. My greatest piece of advice to you all is to hire famous people. The lesson of the Dreyfus Affair is the role of Zola. Imagine the whole thing without Zola having been there and his courage. You wouldn't be talking about it and we wouldn't know about it. UATX didn't have Zola. You need them. Now, have you asked yourself why there are no truly famous faculty at UATX? With all the money, with all the reputation, why are there not famous faculty? There are a lot of famous speakers, but none of them are permanent faculty. Now, no one take insult, please. I'm not saying that the faculty who were there are not, good, but they're not famous, and neither am I. Now, last year, I brought several famous people to the university to hire them, and they said no every time. Why? Because famous people are hard to control. Famous people will speak. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to hire them. I wanted people like Zola around. And that's one of the reasons why the first president vetoed all the famous people, because he didn't want anyone he couldn't control. I encourage you to talk to the current leadership about hiring some famous people. They will not be able to control them, and that will be good. Because in the end, Constitution requires two things. It requires honesty and it requires courage. And the older I get and the grayer my beard becomes, the more I recognize how rare those two things are. And they're really the same thing, courage and honesty. And if UATX had more of it, it would be a much better place now. Last thing I'll say is all of my life, people have thought that it wouldn't be them. Even Christoph probably thought it. Even Ryan probably thought it. Don't think it. My last piece of advice to you is don't think it won't be you. It'll be you. You might be accused. And if it happens, some people will stand up for you and some will not. And you will learn some things about people. But even if you aren't accused, ever, it will still be you. You will be the victim of the death of constitutionalism because you won't hear what a lot of faculty would have said. You will not hear what a lot of students would have said. And you won't hear from a lot of faculty who would have been there. Think of all the things you could have heard, but you will not. All those dogs who won't be barking. I'm proud to have tried constitutionalism there. It may be a lost cause, but maybe not. Maybe not yet. So I'm told I should ask Ryan a couple of questions. Let me end with two I'd like to hear him talk about. Two things struck me as he was speaking. The first one, Ryan, is that you mentioned about the connection of Platonic thought and Straussian thought and the possible tension between Platonic thought and Straussian thought and constitutionalism. Evan Mandery mentioned this in Politico, though he didn't fully explain it. Is he right? Is it actually true that UHEX has a fundamental problem because there are too many Platonists and Straussians and a place within a Straussian university simply can't be a constitutionalist one? Is he right about that? And is that actually the root of the issue? It comes down to ideas all the way down. And the second question I'd like you to talk about, to me, Zola is the hero, of course, and the really interesting figure, the one who's really hard to understand. And my question is this: how do we encourage more people at UATX to be as foolish as Zola?
Thank you, Morgan. These are brilliant remarks, and I'm so excited to have you offer your words of wisdom one last time, perhaps not the last time for the students here. So I don't think that it's true that in a university can be characterized by one living or dead author. I also don't know that there is a ponderant majority, or even a decisive majority of political theorists or professors who are associated with or under the influence of Leo Strauss. What I will say is that among the professors, there is at least a constellation of thinkers who have been influenced by either Leo Strauss or graduate programs that have been taught by his students and proteges in the past. And because of that, because it's a live topic of controversy, both decades past and continuing in the present, people often focus on this and see a kind of signature of his thought that is carried through and echoed with the voices of current faculty. And so without attempting to defame anyone in particular or any school of thought, I would argue that there is a fundamental tension, in fact, between Platonic philosophy and the thought of Leo Strauss, which often goes under the name of Socratic philosophy, that is to distinguish Socrates from Plato. And the principal reason for this is, I believe, as I also understand the contemporary reception of Plato, his living school of tradition that he founded at the Academy, continuing through the early, middle, and late Platonism, all the way up through the new Platonic school of Athens in the 6th century, and even continuing through the Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions that interpreted it, that Plato was a metaphysical thinker. He believed in a hierarchy of forms descending from the first principles through the diffusion of them, through modes of dyadic multiplicity, through most generic kinds, down through paradigms and their various instantial manifestations. And in doing so, he also believed that the gods could be known by our understanding of the ideas themselves and the way by which we structured their relation in a hypothetical form of thought that was ultimately grounded in its own hypostatic form of self-manifestation. And this was a belief that was advocated by figures like Plotinus, by Proclus, and then carried through by figures like Porphyry, Victorinus, Augustine, from Augustine to all Latin Christianity, through Dionysius and Maximus the Confessor, through all Eastern Christianity, and then to the medieval scholastics, and all the way up to the present day. Now, key to this is that there is a way by which we can know truth itself through the study of first philosophy, metaphysics. That is the study of what can be known of being qua being, and the way by which it proceeds from those principles into intelligible forms of reality that give an internal understanding to what things are and how they can be known, that is the essence of things and their very subsistent constitutions. With all that being said, I believe that Plato was firmly committed to the belief that truth could be known and that justice was served by knowing the truth and acting upon it. And that the story of Socrates, his trial and his death, should be understood in that light, that he dies not for political expediency. If he wanted political expediency, he could have left the prison cell. He had people who were willing to help him escape. If he wanted to be a tyrant, he could have followed the way of Alcibiades. He could have taken control of Athens, just like Alcibiades had. But he decided to die for the image of the philosopher, the life of the philosopher who lives for truth rather than for profit and expedience. And in doing so, he gives us an image of how it is we ought to serve justice and the ends of virtue of our own soul that is true to itself, rather than serving the interests of the political party or our own power. And I think that stands in direct contrast to any view of philosophy that endorses a noble lie or that regards political power as predominant and sacrifices metaphysics to the altar of that power that it can instrumentalize through various rhetorical means. So now there's a lot to be said about the thought of Strauss himself and his successors. I don't know that we can quite go into that, but if we like, we can discuss that. I myself have a radically different interpretation of Plato, and I see that as more consonant both with the Christian tradition, with the story of the Gospels, as well as the way by which it's been received ever afterwards, and explicitly in figures like Charles Péguy, who saw in the Dreyfus Affair a Strauss, you might say, a Socratic moment, whereby we have to choose whether truth can be known and justice should be followed in fighting for it. Oh, lastly, why do we not have Emile Zola today? I believe that in order for us to be like Zola, we have to first suspend judgment where we do not know whether it is true or not what has happened. And then we have to ask whether we have followed the procedures that we have set out constitutionally and through our procedures of finding out the truth through justice before we come to such conclusion. So in any such case, if you have a friend who's accused, if you were accused, if you see someone on television who's accused, you read of someone, ask first, have they found that through the mechanism of justice, have they followed through the procedures of examining the evidence, allowing the plaintiff to dispute the evidence, have they allowed to interrogate witnesses and so on? And it's only through those procedures that we can possibly gain a glimmer of whether it is the accusations mere and true. And what I think you will find is that even with all that, that is the best way we can hope to find it, because that is the best way we can publicly expose the evidence and allow it for it to be contested. But it's never sufficient. There's never going to be a point in time where we will know with complete certainty whether or not someone is accused. Until this present day, cases like Dreyfus are still being contested. Cases like O.J. Simpson are still being contested. Brett Kavanaugh's case will still be contested, and many others. The accusation will stain someone's legacy, and you'll never be able to expunge that stain entirely. But what we do know is that the procedures of justice, if followed, if they do not show that someone is guilty, and if not validly upheld within a court of law, we do not have the right in and of ourselves, without having seen that evidence, without having known it happen, to judge them to be guilty. And I think on that basis, if you recognize that, then you will have the courage to uphold justice and to fight for the rights of the accused, even when it seems like no one else will.